She always assumed that boy was just a story.
I gave the twin of this to a boy once. He never came back.
"Get your hands off my equipment and get off my ship." The words carried the whole length of the hangar bay, sharp enough that 300 sailors in dress whites went still. Not a cough, not a shuffle, just the low hum of a warship and one voice cutting through it like a blade. Every head that dared to turn saw the same thing. A woman in an admiral's uniform, spine like a drawn wire, and a man on one knee in front of an open access panel, in coveralls the color of old oil. The mechanic did not flinch. He stayed low by the panel, sleeves shoved to the elbow, forearms streaked with grease, one hand still resting on the coupling he'd been torquing when the Admiral found him, and beside his toolbox sat a little girl, cross-legged on the cold steel deck, coloring a paper sun with far too many rays. He didn't look up right away. He finished the quarter turn on the fitting first, the way a man does when the thing in his hands matters more than the person raising their voice at his back. "Ma'am," he said, quiet even, "this valve is 2 turns from failing. If it lets go during the ceremony, you lose fire main pressure across the whole aft section. Give me 90 seconds. 90 seconds, remember that number, because the sea was about to give all of them a great deal less than that. Admiral Dana Vane looked at him the way she looked at anything that dared slow her down, like a problem, like a stain on a clean deck. "You're a civilian contractor," she said. "You don't diagnose my ship. You don't speak on my deck, and you certainly do not bring a child aboard a warship on commissioning day." "The valve doesn't care what day it is," he said, still quiet. "Not 1 degree of heat in it." And that was the wrong thing to say to Dana Vane. Or maybe it was the only true thing anyone had said to her all morning, and that was worse. She turned to the officer at her shoulder without waiting another second. "Escort him off. Pull his contract. I want him gone before the colors are posted." The mechanic stood. He didn't argue. He let one long breath out slowly through his nose. He wiped his hands on a rag, folded it once, and reached down for his daughter's hand, calm, unhurried, a man long used to being underestimated by people who would need him later. "Come on, May," he said softly. "Pack up your son." And here is what none of them knew. Not the Admiral, not the officer already reaching for his elbow, not one of the 300 sailors watching a nobody get thrown off their ship. The quiet man in the greasy coveralls had once retaken a hull exactly like this one, in the dark, alone, with a knife between his teeth. And in 90 minutes, the only thing standing between everyone in that hangar and a rigged scuttling charge would be him. To understand how a grease-stained deckhand became the last hope of a guided missile destroyer, you have to go back 3 years, to the day he took off the Trident. His name was Eli Cross. He was 39 years old, and he had spent the best years of his life going into water that other men swam away from. Nobody on the Meridian knew that. They knew a mechanic, a quiet contractor from the refit yard who fixed what broke and never raised his voice. He wore coveralls and a wedding ring on a job that told him to take the ring off. He kept it on. He had a way of moving that the sharper eyes noticed and never quite understood. Too economical, too balanced, like a man who would learn to walk on decks that were trying to throw him into the sea. They'd think about it later. They'd all think about a lot of things later. Eli had been Navy Special Warfare, a combat diver first, then EOD, the men who go down into flooded compartments to cut charges off a hull, while the sea tries to bring the whole thing down on top of them. Call sign, Deacon, 2 bronze stars, and 1 medal they don't let you talk about, for one night he'd never talk about either. He had been very, very good at the worst job in the world. He had made his peace with drowning a dozen times, so that other men wouldn't have to drown once. And then he came home to a war he could not win with any of it. His wife got sick. Her name was Nora. He was on a boat in the Gulf when the first call came. He remembered the exact weight of the phone in his hand, the salt on his lips, the way her voice tried to sound like nothing. He was 3,000 miles away when they finally used the word. Stage 4. He requested compassionate transfer that same hour. He made it home for the last 4 months, and they were the hardest and the most important 4 months of his life. In those 4 months, his daughter Maisie learned to sleep only if his hand was resting on her back, because the world had just proven to her, in the cruelest possible way, that it could take a mother while you weren't looking. Nora made him promise 2 things before she died. 2. Be there, she said, for her, every day, not the medals, her. And then, softer, when she could barely get the breath for it. And come home, Eli, whatever you do with the rest of it, come home. The words left her on the last thin thread of a breath. He promised. And Eli Cross was a man who kept his promises even when it cost him everything he was. So he took off the Trident. He turned down the contracts that paid triple and put him on the far side of the planet. He turned down the men who called him by his call sign and said the teams still needed him. He took a welder's job at a naval refit yard 40 minutes from his daughter's school, because it meant he was home every single night, and every single night he told her the same thing when he tucked her in. No matter how deep it gets, baby, Daddy always comes back up. It had started years ago as a diver's joke, gallows humor for men who worked where the light didn't reach. Somewhere along the way, it had become the only prayer he still knew how to say. He wasn't hiding what he'd been out of shame. Understand that. He was hiding it because the man who did those things was gone, buried, in a quiet way, next to Nora, and the man who was left just wanted to fix valves and pack a lunchbox with a paper sun in it and be home by 6. He didn't want to be a hero again. He had learned, in the most personal way a man can learn anything, exactly what heroes cost the people who sit at home and wait for them. So when an admiral told him to get off her ship, a part of him was almost relieved. Off the ship meant home. Home meant Maisie and dinner, and the world staying small and safe and gray. He should have been so lucky. They didn't get thrown off the ship right away, because the sea does not care about a woman's schedule, and neither, it turned out, did a 7-year-old who suddenly, urgently, had to use the bathroom. While the escorting officer went off to find someone who could actually sign a contractor's release, Eli and Maisie stood to the side of the hangar, out of the flow of white uniforms, waiting. And Maisie did what she always did when they had to wait. She reached up into her father's chest pocket and tugged out the coin. He let her. He always let her. It was the shiniest thing he owned, and she liked to hold it when his hands were busy, and holding his hands busy was most of her job in life. It was a challenge coin, heavy, dark, worn smooth at the edges from years of a big man's thumb. On one face, a trident over an anchor. On the other, 3 words stamped in a half circle, Bitter Harbor, and beneath them, a line of tiny numbers that only 2 living men in the world would ever recognize. "Tell me the story again," Maisie said, walking the coin clumsily across her knuckles, the way he'd taught her on 100 slow afternoons. "Not now, May." "Mez, the one where the ship was sinking, and you went down, instead of up." "Not here, sweetheart." A young sailor passing by slowed, grinned at the picture of them. "Your dad tell you war stories, huh, sweetheart?" Maisie fixed him with the enormous, unbothered dignity of the very young. "He tells me the truth," she said. "He went down into a broken ship to get a man out, when everybody else was going up, and then he came back up too. He always comes back up." The sailor chuckled, ruffled the air near her hair, and moved on. Just a kid, and her dad, and a shiny old coin, and a tall tale. Nobody looked twice. Nobody ever looks twice at the right person. That's the whole tragedy of it. Eli took the coin back and closed his hand around it. He didn't tell Maisie the rest of that story anymore. He'd stopped, a while ago. He didn't tell her how cold the water had been that night, cold enough that his own hands had stopped being his own. He didn't tell her about the sound a hull makes when it's dying around you, that long metal groan, like the ship itself is grieving. He didn't tell her how the man he pulled out of that flooding compartment had gripped his collar with the last of his strength and said, into his ear over the roar of the water, "I owe you a life, son. You hear me? A life." He didn't tell her how, on the flight deck afterward, that same man, an admiral, a legend, had pressed his own coin into Eli's shaking palm, and folded Eli's fingers over it with both hands, and said, "If you ever need anything, anything at all, in this world, you bring me that coin, and it's yours." And he never, ever told her the last part, that the man had died 8 months ago, that Eli had seen the obituary and read it 3 times standing in his kitchen, and then set the paper down and never picked up the phone. Because what do you even say? What does a man like Eli Cross say to the family of a legend? You don't owe me anything. You never did. Rest easy, sir. I've got it from here. He slipped the coin back into his chest pocket, over his heart, where he'd carried it for 3 years without once cashing it in. Overhead, the ceremony was beginning. The band was tuning. He just wanted to sign the paper and take his daughter's hand and go home. Now, the woman who threw him off her ship, because you cannot understand what she did at the end until you understand what it cost her to get there. Admiral Dana Vane had a rule she had never once said out loud. Not to a friend, not to a mirror. She did not accept help, ever. Because help, in her experience, was only ever the thing they used against her later. Everywhere she went, she carried a name that opened every door in front of her and then whispered behind her the moment she'd walk through it. Her father was Admiral Robert Vane, a legend, the kind of officer they name buildings after while he's still alive to be embarrassed by it, a man who had once survived an ambush at sea that killed most of his boarding team and come home and never spoken of it again. Dana grew up in that shadow, learned to walk in it. She joined the Navy to step out of it, and instead she spent 20 years hearing the same sentence, dressed in 100 polite disguises. She only made rank because of who her father was. She only got the ship because of the name on her chest. Nobody ever said it to her face. That was the poison of it. They said it in glances, in the half-second pause before a senior officer took her recommendation, in the way praise always seemed to arrive with an asterisk attached. So she became flawless, not out of vanity, out of survival. She learned every system on every ship she served. She was first to arrive and last to leave. She knew the name of every sailor and the torque spec of every fitting, because knowledge was armor, and control was the only proof she had that she'd earned the chair with her own 2 hands. The Meridian was hers, her first strike group flagship, the thing she had bled 20 years for. And she had buried her father exactly 8 months before this ceremony. Buried the legend, and then gone straight back to sea, 3 days after the funeral. Because grief was one more thing they would use, one more soft place they could point to and say, "See, she isn't hard enough for the weight of that chair." So she did not grieve where anyone could see. She folded it up small and put it somewhere below the waterline of herself, and she went back to work. And when a grease-stained contractor knelt on the deck of her brand-new command and calmly told her a valve was about to fail, told her, in front of 300 witnesses, that she had missed something on her ship, on her day, every single alarm the woman owned went off at once. She didn't see a man trying to help. She had been taught by 20 hard years that no man was ever just trying to help. She saw one more person who decided he knew her ship better than she did. One more asterisk, walking around in coveralls. So she moved to throw him off it, fast, before anyone in that hangar could stand there and agree that he'd had a point. What she would not remember until much, much later was the strangest, smallest thing. The shine of an old coin, turning in a little girl's clumsy hands, and a sudden, inexplicable heaviness in her own chest that she had no name for and no time to examine. Because her father had carried a coin like that, his whole life. She'd seen it 1,000 times without ever really seeing it, and he'd told her about it once. Exactly once, late and quiet, and a little drunk, on the anniversary of an operation he would never name. He'd turned the coin over in his old fingers and said, in a voice she'd never heard him use, "I gave the twin of this to a boy once, a kid who came down into the dark to carry me out of a ship that was already dead. I told him if he ever needed anything, he could bring it to me." And then he'd gone quiet. He never came. She had always assumed that boy was a story. Old men have stories. It's how they carry the years. She never once imagined the boy might be real, might be standing in her hangar bay, in greasy coveralls, being dragged toward the brow on her own furious orders. The escort came back. But he came back with a clipboard and a smug lieutenant named Boyd. The kind of officer who has mistaken cruelty for command presence for so long he can no longer tell the two apart. "Contracts terminated, effective now," Boyd announced, pitching it loud enough for the nearest ranks to hear. Because, for Boyd, an audience was the entire point. You're trespassing on a commissioned warship. That's federal, friend. So let's make this real easy. You and the kid off the brow, and if I catch you anywhere near this yard again, I'll have you flagged so hard you won't get a job mopping a parking lot." He let his eyes travel down Eli, the coveralls, the grease under the nails, the little girl with the paper son, and he smiled the smile of a small man on a good day. "Some people," Boyd said, "just don't know their place." A few sailors laughed, not out of cruelty, just the reflex laugh of a crowd instinctively picking the safe side of a powerful man's joke. The laugh that costs nothing and means nothing and follows a person home anyway. Eli said nothing. He'd been humiliated by scarier men than Boyd, in far worse rooms on far worse nights. It rolled off him like water off a hull. He crouched down. He zipped Maisie's little jacket up to the chin. He tucked a stray hair behind her ear. Then he picked up his toolbox and took her hand and prepared to walk off the USS Meridian without one backward glance. "He was right about the valve, though," an older chief muttered from somewhere in the crowd, not quite quiet enough. "Aft fire main's been ticking all week. I logged it twice." "Then we'll have a real sailor take a look at it," Boyd snapped, wheeling on the sound. Across the hangar, Admiral Vane watched the mechanic gather his tools without a single word of protest, without so much as a flicker of anger in the line of his shoulders, and for one inconvenient half-second she felt it, a cold little tug low in the chest, the thought she could not afford, that she might have gotten something wrong. She pushed it down, below the waterline with everything else. She had a ship to commission and a name to defend, and absolutely no time to be wrong in front of 300 people. So she turned her back on the man in the coveralls, and let one slow breath hiss out through her teeth. And that was the last ordinary moment any of them would ever have. Because of the catering crew that had come aboard that morning. 12 men in crisp white jackets. Their credentials were flawless. Their faces were utterly unremarkable, so ordinary that it should have been the first warning. They were not caterers. They had walked up the brow with the trays and the folding tables and the tall silver carts, and they had smiled at the security check, and every credential had scanned clean, because someone very well paid had made sure that it would. At exactly 1400 hours, as the national anthem began to play, as every sailor on that hangar deck turned to face the colors and squared their shoulders and lifted a hand to their heart, the 12 men set down their trays, and they reached into the tall silver carts and lifted out the weapons they had rolled aboard in plain sight. The first shot went straight up into the overhead, and 300 people learned in one single second, with the anthem still hanging in the air, that the entire shape of the day had just changed forever. They called themselves a private security consultancy. That was the paperwork. What they actually were was a crew of ex-operators gone mercenary. Men who had once worn a uniform and now wore whatever their employer's money bought, led by a lean, unhurried man named Renner, whose calm was the most frightening thing about him. Renner did not shout. Men who shout are afraid. Renner simply spoke, and the room obeyed, because every syllable told you he had done this before and had never once lost. Their contract was simple, and it was cold. Seize the Meridian, hold her for 6 hours, strip the classified missile guidance package out of the Combat Information Center, and walk away rich. And to cover the exit, to erase the evidence and drown the whole scene and buy themselves a clean escape into the chaos, Renner's men were already moving below decks, to rig scuttling charges along the hull, to set a brand-new warship to flood and roll and sink at her own pier, on the day they welcomed her to the fleet. Sailors in dress whites do not carry rifles. The armory was locked tight for the ceremony, exactly as regulations demanded, in 90 seconds, and remember that number. Renner's crew owned the hangar bay and the bridge, and 300 hostages on their knees with their hands laced behind their heads. Of the Admiral among them, forced down onto the deck of her own command, a rifle barrel resting against the back of her flawless, disciplined, unbowed head. "Admiral Vane," Renner said pleasantly, crouching down to bring his eyes level with hers. "Your seek access codes. We can do this whole thing with everyone still breathing. Or we can do it the other way. Your father would have told you to negotiate. He was a smart man, smartest in the fleet," they said. The mention of her father from that mouth on this day went through Dana Vane like a blade. But she said nothing. Instead, her eyes moved, across the kneeling crowd, past the terrified sailors, past the civilian families who had come to watch their loved ones make history, and they stopped on one small girl, alone in a zipped-up jacket, clutching a crumpled paper sun to her chest, her father nowhere in sight, because Lieutenant Boyd had marched Eli Cross off toward the brow not 2 minutes before the first shot. And Dana Vane, with a rifle at her skull, felt the guilt of it land on her like cold water. She had sent the child's father away. She had left a 7-year-old alone in the middle of a hijacking. Except Eli Cross was not at the brow. Eli Cross was already gone. The instant that first round punched into the overhead, 3 years of careful, chosen quiet fell off the man like a drop tool clanging on the deck. The welder, the widower, the guy in the greasy coveralls, all of it gone. He had already moved. Before the echo of the shot had faded, he had shoved Maisie down behind a heavy forklift near the bulkhead into the one blind spot he'd clocked the second he came aboard, because some part of him never stopped clocking them. He'd dropped to her level, put his lips right against her ear, and said the 6 words that were the entire architecture of her world. "Do not move, do not make a sound." And then, "Daddy is coming back up, I promise." She looked at him with Nora's eyes, and she nodded. Because when your father tells you he always comes back up, and he has never once been wrong, you believe him even when the whole world is coming apart. And then Eli Cross slipped sideways into the shadow of the hangar, the way water finds the one crack in a hull, silent, certain, inevitable. Not away from the guns, toward them. The first mercenary to die never even saw the man who did it. He was posted at the aft ladder well, rifle up, watching a passage he had been told would stay empty, and a shape came out of the dark behind him, and a grease-stained forearm closed across his throat, and the world simply switched off. The last thing that man ever felt was a set of hands moving with a precision that had nothing at all to do with fixing valves. Eli lowered the body to the deck without a single sound. He took the radio, the sidearm, the rifle, the spare magazines, and the man's earpiece. Then he pressed himself into the shadow, and he did the thing the teams had drilled into him 10,000 times. He listened. He listened, and he learned, and he counted. 12 hostiles. Renner on the bridge, a control element on the hangar deck sitting on the hostages, and a team working below, down in the guts of the ship. And then the word came over the net, and it turned all the blood in Eli Cross's body to cold seawater. Charges. They were rigging the hull to sink her, below the waterline, in the flooded, cramped, black spaces where the sea gets in. Something in his jaw went hard and still. His spaces. The exact kind of space Eli Cross had spent a career learning to die in so that no one else would have to. And his daughter was aboard. Somewhere above him, folded behind a forklift, counting on a promise. If the ship went down, she went down with it. A something settled in him then. Not rage. Rage is loud and clumsy and gets people killed. This was the other thing. The cold, clear, terrible calm the teams had built in him one bad night at a time. The stillness at the very bottom of the water, where the panic can't reach. Up on the hangar deck, a mercenary keyed his radio and reported that his aft man had gone quiet. Renner's brow creased just slightly. He sent 2 more men to check. And after a while, those 2 went quiet as well. By the time the sailors kneeling on the deck began to understand, in whispers and in widening eyes, that something in the dark was hunting the hunters, 3 of Renner's 12 were already down, and the pleasant, unhurried calm had begun, for the first time, to drain out of the mercenary's face. It was Lieutenant Boyd, of all the people in the world, kneeling in the front row with his hands on his head, who said it out loud. He was staring, white-faced, at a grainy security feed on a mercenary's tablet, at a shape moving through the aft passages of the ship, not running, not hesitating, flowing. Through steel corridors it seemed to know better than the men who served on them, like it had been born down there in the dark. "That's," Boyd whispered, and his voice cracked clean in half. "That's the mechanic. Oh my God, that's the guy. That's the guy we threw off the ship." And Admiral Dana Vane, on her knees, rifle at her head, turned her eyes toward the aft hatch. and she felt something rise in her chest that she had not felt in 8 long, gray, grieving months. Hope. And it was shaped, precisely and unmistakably, like the man she had humiliated and discarded not 1 hour before. Eli reached the edge of the hangar the same way he had left it, from a direction no one was watching. But he did not come in shooting. Shooting into a room full of hostages was how you got hostages killed. That wasn't the job. Instead, he came in talking, from the dark, his voice flat and even and everywhere at once, patched over a dead man's radio into the compartment speakers so that it seemed to come from the walls of the ship herself. Renner. The whole hangar went still at the sound of that calm voice from nowhere. Bitter harbor crew, aren't you? I recognize the rigging pattern. Symmetric charges, forward and aft, timed to roll her. That's old work. That's specific work. A pause. Long enough to make a room full of armed men afraid of an empty corridor. I used to cut charges off hulls for a living, the voice went on. So here's what happens now. I'm going to go below, and I'm going to take every one of yours off, one at a time, and every man you send down after me is going to stop answering his radio. You already know that part. You've already lost 3. Renner's jaw tightened, one small muscle jumping. He lifted his own radio slowly. Who? He said, and for the first time there was an edge under the calm. Are you? And here. Only here. Eli stepped into the light, just for a moment, just far enough for the Admiral kneeling on the deck to see him. And he set something down on the steel. He didn't throw it, he set it down, deliberate, almost gentle, a coin. It rang once against the deck, bright and clear over all that fear, and it spun, and it wobbled, and it settled, trident up, trident up. Deacon, Eli said, you tell whoever hired you that name. He'll know it, and he'll know he sent you into the wrong ship. Admiral Vane stared at that coin, spinning to stillness on the deck of her own command, and the entire roaring world went quiet in her ears. Bitter Harbor, the operation her father never named, the kid who came down into the dark. I gave the twin of this to a boy who carried me out of a dying hull. I told him if he ever needed anything, he could bring it to me. He never came. Good men never do. She had thought it was a story. A legend's fond old ghost. And he was standing in her hangar bay, in grease-stained coveralls, with her father's coin ringing on her deck. You knew my father. It came out of her in barely a breath, not a question. The disciplined Admiral's voice, that flawless instrument of command, cracked straight down the middle for the first time in 20 years. Bitter Harbor. That was him. You're the one he. Admiral Robert Vane. Eli said the name the way you set down something heavy and precious. And for one single second, the war left his face entirely, and something much older and much gentler stood there in its place. I went down into a flooding compartment for him. I got him out. He shouldn't have been alive to give me that coin. But he was. He pressed it into my hand on the flight deck and told me to bring it to him if I ever needed anything. His hand closed briefly at his side. A grief, folded very small, carried a very long way. He died, Eli said, before I ever needed anything badly enough to come. So I guess. I'm bringing it to his daughter instead. Then the gentleness was gone, and the war came back into his face like a tide, and he was gone with it. Into the dark, downward, toward the water, toward the charges. And Dana Vane knelt on the deck of her ship and understood all at once and far too late that the man she had thrown out with the trash that morning was the entire reason she had ever had a father to lose. Renner did the math a beat too late, because good soldiers gone bad always do. He understood, finally, that the guidance package was worthless if the ship never actually sank to hide the theft. And the ship would never sink. Not while a former EOD diver was down there in the dark, patiently pulling the charges off her hull, one careful wire at a time. So Renner did the only thing he had left. He pulled his 3 best men off the hostages, the real operators, the ones with the dead, quiet eyes, and he sent them below, into the flooded aft spaces, to find the diver and kill him in the one place on Earth that was supposed to be his home. They should have known better. You do not fight a fish by jumping into the water. Down there in the black, in seawater already climbing past his chest and rising by the minute, Eli Cross was home. In the worst and truest way a man can ever be home. He took Maisie's face, her nod, her small trusting eyes, and he set it gently at the very back of his mind, behind a door, where it would be safe and where it could not slow his hands, and he let the cold clarity take the wheel. The thing the teams had forged in him, one drowning at a time, that even 3 years of grief and grease had never quite managed to burn out. The first charge he found by feel alone, in water too dark and churned to see through. His fingers read the shape of it like a blind man reading a face. He traced the wires. He found the initiator. He cut it. He floated the dead charge up and away. The first man he took in the black water, where a rifle is a useless thing and a knife is the only argument that matters. The man never adjusted to the dark and the cold and the drowning. Eli had lived there for 20 years. He found the second charge by the second bulkhead, and the second man not long after. He was working the wires when the third one found him. And the third man was good. The third man got an arm around Eli's throat from behind and drove him down under the rising water and held him there. Pinned him against the deck of a flooding compartment with the weight of them both, and above the two struggling men, on the last live charge, a small red timer ticked its numbers steadily down toward 0. And here, 30 feet down in a dying hull, with a killer on his back and the last of the air burning out of his chest, Eli Cross did the exact thing he had promised his daughter 1,000 times he always did. He did not fight for the surface. He did not claw upward toward the air and the light and the living. He went down, instead of up. Down, against every screaming instinct in the human body, toward the last charge. Wire cutters clenched in his teeth. He reached it with the mercenary's arm still locked around his throat and stars bursting behind his eyes. He got the jaws of the cutter around the initiator wire, and with the very last of himself, with his lungs shrieking and the dark closing in from the edges, he cut it. The timer died. The charge went dead in his hands. And only then, only after the ship was safe, only after his daughter was safe, did Eli Cross turn to the business of staying alive. He broke the arm at the elbow, he put the third man down into the dark to stay, and he planted his boots on the deck of the flooding compartment, and he kicked upward for the surface, the disarmed charge floating dead and harmless beside him. He broke the surface of the black water, gasping. He came back up. He always came back up. When he hauled himself out of the flooded ladder well, streaming seawater, chest heaving like a bellows, the last dead charge still gripped in one fist, there was exactly one thing left standing between 300 hostages and their freedom. Renner, on the bridge, with a pistol pressed hard against Admiral Vane's temple, and absolutely no cards left to play. Eli walked onto the bridge of the USS Meridian, dripping seawater across her deck plates, unhurried, in no particular rush at all, the very same walk he had used to leave the ship that morning, when they'd all decided he was nobody, a man long accustomed to being underestimated by people who suddenly, desperately needed him. "It's over, Renner," he said. "Your charges are dead, everyone. Your men are down. There's a Coast Guard cutter inbound, and there's no water left anywhere for you to disappear into. You have exactly one move on this board that ends with you still breathing." "I've got the Admiral," Renner said. He pressed the pistol harder against her head to make his point. Dana Vane did not so much as blink. "You've got a hostage," Eli answered, and his voice never rose, not by a hair, "who's worth nothing to me the second you pull that trigger, and worth everything to you as long as you don't, so don't." A pause. "I carried her father out of a hull worse than this one, colder, darker, further gone. You really believe I went back down into that water tonight, after 3 years of choosing not to, just to stand here and watch you finish a job the sea couldn't?" And here, right here, is the moment that broke the entire day wide open. Because Admiral Dana Vane, who had never once, in her whole armored life, accepted help from another living soul, who had built her entire command, her entire self, on the bone-deep terror of ever needing anyone, looked up at the soaking wet mechanic she had thrown off her ship that very morning. And she made the first truly humble decision of her career. She stopped fighting Renner's grip. She let her body go still and loose. She caught Eli's eye across the bridge, and with the smallest motion of her chin, with everything she had never been able to say to anyone, she told him without a single word, "I trust you. Take the shot the moment it's clear. I will give you the line." Then Dana Vane drove her elbow back into her captor, dropped all her weight straight down toward the deck, and cleared herself out of the way. Eli took the shot. Renner went down. And in the ringing, ears-numbed silence that followed, it was, at last, over. Dana Vane rose to her feet on the bridge of her own ship, and the very first thing she did, before the cutter, before the medics, before the cleanup crews and the debriefs and the cameras that would come for all of it, was walk across the deck to the man standing in a spreading pool of seawater, and unclip her sidearm from her hip, and hold it out to him. Grip first. "You should be armed until this ship is secure," she said, "and I should be the one who hands it to you." Her voice was steady, her eyes were not. "I threw you off my ship this morning. I called your daughter a liability to your face, and you went down, instead of up, for a deck full of people who laughed at you." "You were protecting your ship, Admiral," Eli said quietly, and he meant it. "That's your whole job. I'd have thrown me off, too." And Dana Vane, Admiral, a legend's daughter, a woman who did not cry, ever, and certainly not on her own bridge, laughed once, wet and cracked and utterly astonished, the laugh of a person finally setting down a weight they've carried so long they'd forgotten it was ever separate from their own body. Boyd, somewhere behind them, had gone a truly remarkable shade of white and had discovered a sudden, urgent interest in the deck plates. Maisie was still behind the forklift, exactly where he'd left her, paper sun crushed in both small fists, and when Eli finally came out of the dark for the last time, soaked to the bone, bleeding a little at the brow, alive, she did not run to him. She just looked up at her father, and she said, in the flat, certain, unshakable voice of the very young, "You came back up." "I always come back up, baby." He knelt and gathered her in, coveralls and seawater and blood and all, and held her the exact way he'd held her the night the world first proved it could take a mother while you weren't looking. "I promised you, remember, no matter how deep it gets." Across the ruined, silent hangar, Dana Vane watched a man who had just cleared a hijacked warship single-handed kneel down on the steel, and with hands that could kill in the dark, gently smooth the wrinkles out of a child's crayon drawing. Like flattening that paper sun was the single most important repair he would perform all day. And here is the lesson, and it deserves to be said plainly, without decoration, without music. We are taught all our lives that power is the thing that keeps us safe. The rank on the collar, the name on the building, the control of every last rivet on the ship, and Dana Vane had all of it, every piece. And it put her on her knees, with a gun to her head, on the deck of her own command, because power that cannot bear to ever need anyone is just a colder, lonelier word for alone. What saved that ship, and every soul aboard her, was not the Admiral's command. It was not the legend's famous name. It was a man in grease-stained coveralls that every single person on that deck had already decided did not matter. A man who had learned, the hardest way there is, that real strength is not going up when going up is easy. Real strength is being willing to go down, into the cold and the dark and the drowning, for people who never once said thank you, for people who laughed. And the cruelest thing we do, all of us, every single day, is look at the quiet ones, the ones fixing our valves, mopping our decks, carrying our bags, and decide, without a second glance, that they must have nothing to offer, simply because they have never once told us what they survived to be standing there so calm in front of us. Dana Vane spent her whole life terrified that needing help would make her weak. It took a sinking ship and a widower with a knife between his teeth to finally teach her the truth. That letting the right person carry you is not weakness. Sometimes it is the only reason you still have a father left to bury it all. The Navy tried to give Eli Cross a medal for what he did on the Meridian. He turned it down. He asked them, instead, to give the reinstated yard contract to the older chief who'd spoken up for him about the valve. And he asked them to quietly strike Lieutenant Boyd's name off the incident citation, because Boyd had spent the entire crisis frozen on his knees. And Eli Cross believed with everything in him that a man's very worst day should not be the thing they carve into bronze. They did name something after him, in the end, though not for the reason the cameras thought, and not in the way the brass expected. The Meridian got a new program that year, a standing invitation, for the yard workers, the welders, the contractors, the cooks, the invisible people whose hands keep a warship breathing and who never once get to stand for the colors, to come aboard on Family Day and be seen and be known by name. Admiral Dana Vane made certain of it, and she made certain it had a name of its own. The Deacon Standard. One single line. Posted on the brow of the ship, where every sailor reads it as they come aboard. You never know who you're walking past. Treat them like you'll need them, because one day you will. Eli kept the welding job, home every night by 6. He had learned, in blood, exactly what heroes cost the people who sit at home and wait for them, and he was done, forever, with making anyone he loved wait. But on a Sunday in spring, at a barbecue, in a small ordinary backyard, where the pale moon had come up early and hung in the blue daytime sky, Admiral Dana Vane stood beside a widower flipping burgers on a cheap grill. Not in front of him, not behind him, beside him, and for a long, easy while, neither one of them said anything at all. "You still carry it?" she finally asked, watching the smoke rise. "His coin." Eli patted his chest pocket, over his heart where it had always lived. "Every day." "He'd have liked you," Dana said, and her voice, the flawless instrument, went soft and uneven at the edges. "My father. He'd have liked that you never once called it in, that you just—" She had to stop. "That you just came back up and went home and said nothing to anybody for 3 whole years." "Wasn't nothing to say, Admiral." "Dana," she said. "Out here, it's Dana." Across the little yard, Maisie shrieked with laughter on a battered swing set, pumping her legs, going higher and higher. Fearless in the way that only a child can be fearless when she is absolutely, bone-deep certain that someone will always be there to catch her when she comes back down. "Watch me," she screamed, delighted, to the whole blue sky. "Watch me, Daddy. I'm going all the way up." "I've got you," Eli called back to her without a flicker of worry. "I've always got you, baby. Go as high as you want." And Dana Vane, who had buried a legend and inherited his long, cold shadow, and finally, on the deck of a dying ship, found the one living man who had known her father as something more than a name on a building, stood beside the widower in the ordinary, forgiving sun. And she let herself, for the first time in a very, very long time, simply be held up by someone else. So, if you believe that the quietest man in any room is usually the one who has survived the very most, if you believe that real strength goes down into the dark for people who will never once say thank you, then type it. Type, "He came back up," down in the comments. Let me see you. And if Eli's promise to his little girl, "I always come back up," if that landed somewhere real in your chest tonight, then hit that like button so that more people get to hear it, and subscribe. Because the next story we tell is about a night shift airport janitor, a man everyone stepped right over, every single day, until the one night a plane full of strangers needed the exact thing that only he knew how to do.